Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma. Movie breakdown and ending explained. At first glance, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma looks like a completely insane 1980s style slasher. There's a summer camp, there's sex, there's gore, and there's a killer called Little Death. But if you watch this movie expecting a normal horror story, the ending is going to leave you completely confused. Because Camp Miasma isn't really about a killer. It's about what happens when the movies we obsess over become part of who we are. And by the end, the line between the movie and reality basically disappears. Our main character is Kris Williams, played by Hannah Einbinder. Kris is a young queer filmmaker who gets an opportunity to revive an old horror franchise called Camp Miasma. The fictional franchise is basically this universe of a huge 1980s slasher series. Think decades of sequels, VHS tapes, merchandise, and increasingly ridiculous storylines. And at the center of the franchise is its killer, Little Death. Little Death wears a bizarre square metal mask and carries a spear. But the original Camp Miasma has a problem. Its mythology is deeply rooted in the kind of transphobic horror stereotypes that were common in older slashers. So Kris is hired to reinvent the franchise for a new generation. But instead of immediately writing the reboot, she decides to find the person who understands Camp Miasma better than anyone, the original final girl, Billy Presley. Billy is played by Gillian Anderson, and she isn't living like a normal retired actress. She's living at the old summer camp where the original movie was filmed, surrounded by memorabilia, old footage, paintings, and the ghosts of the character she once played. Kris initially approaches Billy as a filmmaker researching a role, but very quickly, something else develops between them. Kris is fascinated by Billy, and Billy seems to understand Kris in a way that nobody else does, because Kris has a problem. She intellectualizes everything. She can analyze a horror movie for hours. She can explain its symbolism, its politics, its history, but actually allowing herself to experience desire, that's much harder. And Billy slowly forces her out of her head. That's when the movie's real subject becomes clear. Sex and fear aren't necessarily opposites. Sometimes the things that scare us can also become the things that help us understand ourselves. And this is where Little Death becomes much more important than just a slasher villain. The original Camp Miasma uses Little Death as a monster, but Kris becomes fascinated by what that monster represents, because the franchise is simultaneously about violence, sexuality, shame, and transformation. There's even a crucial scene where Kris and Billy watch the original movie together. Kris sees the film differently now. Something that once seemed like simple exploitation suddenly looks like a story about the actress who was trapped inside it. Billy's own experience making the original movie has left a psychological mark on her. And Kris realizes that the horror movie isn't simply something Billy acted in. It became part of her. And maybe that's why Billy has spent years creating art around Little Death. She's been trying to process her own past through the fictional monsters. The movie starts breaking apart. Eventually, Kris has to present her reboot idea to the studio executives. And here's the problem. Her idea isn't the safe Hollywood reboot they wanted. Instead of simply making Little Death into another generic monster, Kris wants to tell the story from the killer's perspective. She's no longer trying to fix Camp Miasma from the outside. She's trying to understand why the movie affected people in the first place. And the executives hate it. But ironically, that rejection is exactly what Kris needs, because she finally stops creating what other people expect from her. She starts creating something that actually belongs to her. And at the same time, her relationship with Billy becomes increasingly intimate and surreal. Reality begins behaving like a horror movie. The camp feels less like a real location and more like a movie set that has come alive. And then we reach the part that has confused a lot of viewers. The final sequence deliberately blurs everything. Little Death returns. The imagery becomes increasingly dreamlike. Sex, violence, fear, and desire collapse into the same visual language. And the question becomes, are we watching reality or are we watching Camp Miasma? The important thing is that the movie never gives us a conventional answer, and that's intentional. The camp isn't simply a haunted location. It's basically a psychological space. It's where Kris and Billy can become versions of themselves that they couldn't be anywhere else. So when the movie appears to cross completely into the world of Camp Miasma, it's not necessarily saying everything that happened was literally supernatural. It's saying something more interesting. The fiction has become real enough to change them. And that's why the ending feels like a loop. The characters are no longer simply watching the horror movie. They're inside it, what the ending actually means. This is also why the title is so important. Teenage sex and death at Camp Miasma. It's deliberately ridiculous. But those three ideas, sex, death, and cinema, are basically the entire movie. Kris begins the story as someone who watches. She watches movies, she analyzes people, she studies desire. She turns everything into an intellectual exercise. But Billy teaches her something completely different. Sometimes you have to stop analyzing the experience